Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our issue briefing here, the first issue briefing of the afternoon, day 3 of the annual meeting 2019 here in Davos, Switzerland. Welcome to you, those of you joining us here in the room and also those of you watching live online. My name is Cann. I'm the head of strategic communications here at the forum. Now, judging by the number of brightly coloured badges here, one might get the feeling this is a topical and certainly news-generating issue at the moment. Of course, it's gene editing. We're going from the themes of the morning's issue briefings on the economy and globalization to very much the future, an emerging technology that is very much at the crossroads right now. Those of you that know issue briefings know that these are quite short sessions. They're half an hour. So we encourage as much rapid exchange as possible. Please do feel free to throw your hands up, ask questions. Feel free to disagree with each other to the point where you feel comfortable. We like to have as much dynamism as possible and have as much fun. That's why we're here in the media centre, not in the main centre. We don't get away with what we get away with if we're out there. And that's an absolute fact. So, of course, there is a topical news hook to this gene editing. We've all been aware of CRISPR and excited and slightly kind of overawed by its potential. But it very much came into reality late last year when the news came out that scientists in China had genetically modified a human embryo. It's been made headlines globally ever since, and in fact, it's a very live story that has been updated. I don't want to dwell on that particular story so much, but I want to use it as the starting point because it has opened up a very vibrant and robust conversation about the need for international standards. So, without further ado, and with very little more from me on this subject, I'm going to hand over to my two columnists. Very delighted to be joined by Jodi Halpern, on my immediate left, Professor of Bioethics and Medical Humanities at the University of California, Berkeley. Victor Dzau, you're President of the National Academy of Medicine in the USA. So I couldn't have two more esteemed colleagues join me. Victor, if I may, I'll start with you. Sure. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the state of international consensus around the need to put in place some kind of governance, some kind of coordination across various scientific communities and establishments.
Sure. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to talk to all of you. It is indeed a very important topic. I think this technology, CRISPR in this case, because there are other gene editing techniques, is breathtaking. And it will change, I believe, therapeutics in many different ways. So this technology is as you know, being able to precisely molecular scissor take out a specific sequence, and now we can even do it in single bases and possibly even replace it. So you can imagine you can take away a bad gene and then replace it with a good one, or just remove the bad one. I should begin by saying that you can apply it in somatic therapy and germline. Where the controversy is around the germline. In somatic therapy, which is using this technology to treat diseases, acquired diseases that you and I have, or even genetic diseases, but in the adult, not in the embryo. I think there's uniform agreement that this is a good thing, and that this will be an important advancement in the treatment of diseases when you deliver it to a specific organ or cells or others, right? So we should put that aside. The issue is going to be manipulating embryos or germlines, including gametes, which are eggs and sperms. Possibly now you can do that. And therefore changing generational genetic makeup. And so the offsprings are therefore altered probably indefinitely in terms of a genetic makeup. That's where the controversy is. I think where people would agree is to do this for what people call designer babies, right? Gene enhancement, to make people as handsome as me. Sorry. As smart as me? No. Much better, much more. Or I want to be Usain Bolt, That is certainly not in the books. I think that's very clear that the universal community says, we're just not ready to do that yet. And it really should be banned at this point of time. So this leads to the issue of what about if you had inherited diseases that's not treatable, no alternative, and uniformly lethal. So there, you know, as a scientist, I would say, yeah, you know, this technology could be good for humanity, cure diseases where there's so much suffering, you know, among people with cystic fibrosis, Huntington's, you name it, right? So that's where the starting point is. So I would say that, generally speaking, the scientific community thinks it's a good thing. It should advance. However, we're just not ready. And there's so many other things we need to address, we will get there. There is a segment of community, even in science, to say we should ban this altogether because you open up the little bottle and let the genie out, and it could be misused, where there are alternatives that you can have without having to do this. And what they're talking about is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. In other words, for this to go forward, you're going to have to manipulate the embryo, which means you're going to have IVF anyway, in vitro fertilization. And what really is happening is that you can take cells from a blastocyst and just analyze whether, if you have a couple that has one of them carries, say, a dominant disease, they can simply assess whether the embryo contains the genetic mutation or not and discard the embryo and find the right one. The problem, of course, is that IVF fails frequently. It's not easy to do. And certainly in more recent European study, that in conditions such as this, that is, you know, heritable disease, etc., IVF fails about up to 70% of the time. So there's a debate whether it should be totally banned or whether we should at least give those people who fail IVF the chance to think about eventually to have cures through this technology. I know I've been giving a long answer, but let me get to the point about international. So I think what happened in China, and by the way, the International Summit was organized by the U.S. National Academy and the Royal Society and the Hong Kong Academy of Science. And because we were surprised by this announcement, and the reaction was, well, listen, we don't think we're ready yet. How do we know how safe this is? How do you know whether the offsprings will be properly monitored? Have we actually checked all the boxes that's necessary to move forward? And I say there's uniform agreement in the community that that was way too early, premature, and to the point that I think the scientists have been condemned, if you will, by the community. 125 scientists in China right away wrote a letter to say that shouldn't be done. And then, of course, you follow all the subsequent issues, including the preliminary finding of investigation just came out. Let me stop here because there is a sequel to this, what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, I was about to suggest, actually, just as you reached that point, and there's lots of negativity about what happened and the lack of coordination or signalling about what was to happen. Perhaps this was a good thing because it's forced the community to wake up to the fact that even if there is a uniform consensus amongst the established community, then this technology is available, and now you have to actually deal with it.
That's right. So, in fact, there are two seminal reports, or important reports, that outline the conduct and the principles. One is our report, National Academies of 2017. Second is the Nuffield Council report of 2018. And it was fairly clear in those reports that you have to use it in a really medically compelling situation where there's no alternative. And there's got to be good oversight mechanism and good ways to know safety and also monitoring. So I believe what happened was that those reports, which were really quite good, if not even excellent, did not spell the conditions specific enough. So this is my interpretation now. Dr. He can rationalize saying that HIV is a compelling need. So we need to be very clear, right? What is a compelling need, right? And he can rationalize, he did have ROB consent. So what is the right oversight mechanism? Those things, I think, and safety. We have no idea what the safety profile is. These babies are born. How do we know who's going to be followed and what happens to them? So all those things need to be now revisited. This is what we're planning to do. And I'd be happy to talk about this after Jodi had a...
Sure.
And you queued up the issues.
Yeah.
Should I just pick up on what?
Please do.
Because we've been talking. But Dr. Dzau just brought up the issue of respect for human research subjects, which is we'll go with the dramatic case of Dr. Hay. I just want to say a few facts first that people might not know. So the couple that participated with him in the study, it's very likely, it was an HIV-positive father and a normal mom, it's very likely that they could not get access to IVF and sperm washing without being in this study because there's stigma and cost issues. And IVF with sperm washing, with no gene editing at all, just IVF, which we do here with HIV-positive couples, that rendered the baby at basically essentially no risk of being HIV positive. So the additional step of then doing an edit, a gene edit to the CCR5 gene was not to treat a serious disease. There was no disease. Those fetuses were totally normal before the gene editing. So this was totally failed.
And there's treatment for HIV, chronic treatment.
Right, so it doesn't meet, so that's the thing. But what I want to focus on is how did this happen? Not so much rogue actors, but I think that this shows a big challenge we have in bioengineering ethics. And we've been talking about that throughout Davos this entire week. So for other cell treatments as well as gene editing. What happens is that Hay, I mean, it's a doctor, but he's a PhD, and Michael Deem from Rice University, they're both PhD physicists. They never were inculcated in the culture of human subjects research that people who were clinicians or clinical researchers would have been. And I studied those things, and I know how desperate patients and families are and how much they'll accept anything if this is the only way they can treat the HIV positive father in order to have a baby. They didn't have that deep enculturation, and guidelines are very important, but guidelines without culture, I would argue from my research, don't work. And what I think is amazing is that they flipped in the press. First, Dr. Hay said that he did very thorough informed consent, and Michael Deem went there to the informed consent process with him as an expert. And in the New York Times yesterday, Michael Deem's lawyer said, oh, he doesn't do research on human subjects. He doesn't know anything about that. So the first thing is we have these physicists that had the Yiddish term chutzpah to do research on human subjects. I just want to give a positive counterexample. At UC Berkeley 4 years ago, this is how I got into gene editing as an ethics professor at Berkeley, Jennifer Doudna and Jacob Korn sought me out and said, we've got a problem. We're getting letters from desperate patients and families looking for genetic cures. And Jennifer Doudna said, with great humility, it's why I keep working with her, she said, I'm a chemistry professor. I haven't had that ethical culture experience. So we've been developing it at Berkeley. But I think the world needs bioengineering doctoral students throughout, not just in gene editing, to have a culture where they will understand, and because what they missed in this case was so obvious if you were embedded in such a culture.
Thanks, Jodi, and we'll come back to those questions. I'm thrilled, genuinely, we have such a great mix of world-class expertise in the audience, as well as members of the media. So I imagine there's lots of questions. So can we have a quick show of hands, see who has anything to ask? Gentleman there, anybody else? Lady next to him. We'll try to take 2 or 3 at a time. Who's the third?
Oliver, after this round, I'd like to tell you the next steps.
Part 2. Yes, we'll move into the second half. Looking forward to that one. In the meantime, gentleman there, if you give us your question and pass the microphone on.
Chief Bradshaw, New York Times. There was another development in China overnight, which was when Chinese scientists announced that they had modified embryos, not gametes, of 5 monkeys, not humans, to remove a gene so as to cause serious mental illness in the monkeys. And the monkeys have reached adulthood and show signs of severe mental illness in terms of what they interpret as inability to sleep, depression, and so forth.
Right.
So my question is, what are the bioethics of doing experiments on higher order mammals like that, but doing it on the embryos, not the gametes, which is a distinction that you're drawing as being important, Professor Dzau.
So, no, a distinction somatic versus germline.
Yes,
let's move on to the next.
They weren't trying to treat the monkeys, they were
Yes,
just trying
I understand.
to see
So we'll come to that one later. If we just pass the microphone along. I'm not sure what your capacity for consuming news outside this meeting. It tends to be quite busy around here, so maybe you have not heard that even.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Hilary Sutcliffe from Society Inside, which is an NGO in London. I'm on the Synthetic Biology Governance Group in London. This is perhaps an embarrassingly naive question to answer, given what I've just told you. But a lot of the pressure I hear, as you say, Jodi, from desperate patients will be treated in the private sector if that technology is available. And a lot of this conversation is about research ethics, and they don't necessarily have any of that sort of cultural issues we're talking about.
Good question.
Victor, why don't we try to attack the first one first?
Okay.
Higher order mammals, and again, it sounds like there's still a lot of grey areas when it comes to deciding what is okay and what isn't okay.
Well, Keith raised a really important question. It is a very serious ethical question. The suffering of animals, experimental animals that have feelings and thoughts and conscience, right? I mean, we generally justify it when it comes to low order organism, but when you come to, and I'm not trying to justify it, this is the way the scientific community looks at it, but when it comes to primates and others, that would, I would say, confer suffering in conscious animals with a disease that seriously you need to look at whether it's justifiable or not. So I quite agree with you. Keith, I just want to be sure that your comments about gametes, as you know, are the eggs and sperms that lead to the embryos. So we really talk about somatic versus germline, right? Okay. So, so I quite agree with you. This is one that needs to be seriously debated. And I would agree that some governance policy needs to develop whether we can go that far. There are research now being done on human brain cells implanted into animals, where now the concern is you're going to have human conscious, this hybrid research, chimeric research, right? So this is a whole field of ethics argument that needs to be vetted a lot more thoroughly than we are today.
Want me to respond to Hillary then?
Yes, please do.
So I think that it might not be fully what you were trying to ask, but I just want to pick up on the point about private sector. And this goes back to what Victor was saying earlier, which is IVF is expensive, and research in germline gene editing, research and development, because it's so early on to think about it, is going to be very expensive. So one concern about the societal door opening with proper research precautions and proper risks and benefits, let's say everything's done right in that regard, still a problem I have with germline gene editing, and it's not an absolute ban, but it's a concern, is that we have such huge health disparities. And one of the things that I'm worried it will do is create a whole new kind of injustice where you'll have your whole family will be inequitable with other families, because if it's expensive, like it looks like it will be, to, let's say, have the CCR5, let's say, however many years. I just talked about not predicting the years, but sometime in the future, it's safe and effective to have your children gene edited so that they cannot, or are very unlikely to be able to contract HIV. So if you're wealthy and it's very expensive, you would do that for your children. So soon, besides housing and all the other things that are the social determinants of health that make there two classes of people in the world, the haves and have-nots, there'll be an absolutely rigid genetic difference between people and their options for a decent life trajectory. So I'm very concerned about this occurring, not because there's something wrong in principle with messing with life. I don't hold that view. I believe in all the progress we can make in medicine when it's real and alleviates suffering, but because of the injustice in our actual societies.
Well, I mean, I would say, and I agree in the sense that all these amazing technology is going to raise the question, who have access to it, who can afford it?
Yes.
But as a scientist, I do believe that advancements have to be made, and we need the right engagement of the public and the social ethicists and others to get it right. But imagine a world in which your science really can greatly relieve suffering. I think that's also very important.
Yes.
So how do you do that is the question. May I address your question? I think there are several levels of governance. So certainly you're right in the sense that the scientists, the medical community, the ethical community can come together, which is what we're trying to do now as well, and to say, when is it permissible, when is not? But there's another layer, which is the government's governance, or law and policy. This is what you're implying. In other words, in our country, embryo research is not supported by our government, hence there's no funding, right? And Congress says to FDA, you can review germline editing, hence there's no movement forward, right? But that's only one country. Others outright ban this altogether. So our country will allow private sector activity, But the ultimate point is the FDA if you want to have a product. So there is, in fact, but what you're saying is each country must come up with very clear laws, etc., informed by the work that we do as scientists and the ethicists, etc., in terms of what fits the context of culture and beliefs in that country. But you have to have policies. And I think in China they had, in fact, a policy, a law, if you will, about embryo manipulation. So in this case, it's been said that Dr. He has violated that law by manipulating the embryo, right? Now, I should also point out there's a difference between doing embryo research in vitro versus now taking it all the way to reproduction. I think more and more people are supporting the idea you can do more research in discarded embryos, embryos that's not going to be able to, for implantation, etc. I know countries can debate this also, but that's to advance the understanding of science, of development, and ultimately, if we do apply it in human, we'll know a lot more in terms of the reproductive application.
So one of the benefits of being a non-specialist is you get to ask stupid questions. So forgive me, before we go into the second part of what you wanted to say, I'm going to ask a stupid question. But I'm drawing a parallel from what you just said about the need to, accepting that inequality is not such a good thing in terms of the distributive justice of who is able to benefit and profit from this, but also the need to push science forward. And coming from a briefing this morning where we had the chief economists of the IMF and the OECD, the conversation was, there were certainly parallels where there was an awareness of an economic model that would lift global growth forward, but would create inequalities. And you could argue that that has created societal distress now that we're still we're paying for. So are we sleepwalking into another problem?
Well, I would say that the collective governance and conversation is absolutely necessary. And I think World Economic Forum is trying to do that. In fact, they bring together people from different sectors. So, if you imagine that you're in the business sector and your role is to create a product that can create, say, a profit, right? The question is, what's the governance around this issue that Jodi brought up? And if you're on where Jodi works, she'll be very concerned about this. If you're the government, in our case, the payer, if you will, they have to figure out how to address this. So I think early discussion of the right groups of people together is really important because that sensitizes everyone to all the necessary issues they need to address. And public engagement is critically important.
Okay, Victor, so let's go back to, you wanted to continue the...
Well, you asked me what the international community is doing. There are now two initiatives that you should be aware of. They've both been planned, so it's planned initiative. One is the initiative that we at National Academy, with our partners in Royal Society, are pulling together. The Chinese Academy of Sciences joined us, as is a number of other international committees, academies, and we're hoping to get a large number of international scientific, medical academies, along with ethicists, social scientists. And our job is mainly to say, looking at where the science is, what are those very specific criteria guidelines to enable this even considered, deemed permissible, right? So, for example, let's take the issue of side effect. I mean, Dr. He's experiment did not address the side effect. You may say there's not much evidence for off-target, but the fact is, whenever you give a drug, you give a lifetime, you don't know what the side effects are. But regulatory agencies have very clear policies around toxicology, this, that. So we need to develop those, maybe multi-generational observation in animals, et cetera, et cetera. Once you've got that in place, you can't go forward without addressing those issues. Likewise, there's specific conditions of inheritable lethal diseases, maybe failed, IVF, who knows? I mean, failed pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. I'm not saying what the committee should do, but we put in a committee together to address those issues. What kind of governance? So would a local hospital IRB be sufficient? maybe there ought to be a national committee to look at all these new protocols, because they're quite new, and to really have standards to say you can proceed. Long-term monitoring, right? What is the risk assessment, risk-benefit ratio? How do you do that? So I think what we plan to do is to put together a committee that will speak to these issues, and that would inform governments to say, and the scientific community, of course, would say, the community has spoken. We need to abide by these levels. Scientists, journals, you name it, funders, funding agencies. And then the next level would be the government using this information to make policy. So the second initiative is WHO expert panel that's being put together. And their focus is to look at the governance structure. They're being asked by the member states, what do you want, what do we do with this issue? And so they're doing a study, 18 months, 12, 18 months, to come up with a governance structure. So we are collaborating, coordinating, so that more technical report can inform the more kind of governance report.
And Jodi, do you what level of optimism do you have that this governance can be put in place within time?
I don't know how to talk. I talked about not predicting the time, but in terms of governance, I love what's going on, and I think that a couple of things. First of all, the idea of committees that might specialize. I'm thinking of the RAC, the Recombinant Advisory Committee. In the 70s, when we first had synthetic recombinant DNA, and there was the first Asilomar conference, people were worried about monster DNA, and they formed these recombinant advisory committees. They've been very successful, according to most people, in their narrow area of looking at that. And so there's an example of a long-term safe. They're being reformed now, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, that included actually gene therapy protocols.
Yes. And so that's an example of a kind of governance, but that's just expert governance. So that's about safety. That's not this issue of public engagement. Now, public engagement, we study that. My research is partly on that. One thing we haven't talked about, but with the National Academy's guidelines, they did ask the public how they'd feel about germline and had a positive response by many, but what they didn't do, I'm writing an op-ed about this right now, is they didn't ask how would you feel about germline gene editing if for the foreseeable next let's say 2 to 5 years, it was for wealthy people's children, not for your children. So, I mean, I'm not joking, because I think the thing is, public engagement is manipulable. And people need to really know what this really means for their lives. And I think people do not like the idea that other people, just by money, could get not only better other things, like I said, but also have heritable differences. So public engagement has to be very well structured so people know in very concrete case discussions what this really means for their lives. And that requires a lot of psychological and sociologic insight. Finally, we do have examples of what has worked historically, which is the President's Commission in the United States in the 70s, early 80s, looked at an issue that, at least in the U.S., was very controversial, which is, is a person dead when their heart stops beating, or they're dead when they're brain dead in a persistent vegetative state? So that was an area where the public was, like abortion, et cetera, very divided. People were, and scientists were divided from scientists. And when they put the commission together, it was representative of all kinds of views. But what they did, and this is my advice for these commissions, is they didn't, and I've seen a lot of commissions argue about the principles. And what they did is they started talking about the principles. That becomes an abstract way to project, is transparency the most important thing? Well, what does that mean for you? So arguing about principles got people nowhere. But having very focused case series so people could picture what's it like to be in the hospital when someone's in a persistent vegetative state, what does the family go through, what's the medical factual basis of it, what does it mean for hospital costs, what does it mean for identity and dignity, what does it mean for religious groups. So making it very real and then asking the committees to really solve the problems, not just argue each other about ideologies about this or that word of respect or transparency. So I have a very specific view of how those committees should really operate, so that they would involve the public, involve people with diverse points of view, but make them solve hard problems and not just use principles that are just really ideological phrases.
This has been a really reassuring session, and I thank you for that. And so my final question is...
Can I make one more point of clarification? This is my own feeling now. There are people who say this should be banned. There are people who say moratorium. My own feeling is until these issues are addressed, nobody should go forward with these, with the use in embryo reproductive purposes. or even in research purposes.
I second that.
Yeah.
I second that.
So these things need to be so clear that people are now meeting those criteria, and the laws need to be developed in each country.
How far away do you think we are from this?
For our study, it would take at least another 8 months.
It's not very long.
Well, okay, 12 months. I don't know. The sooner the better. We're trying to put together a commission. But for the WHO, probably 12 to 18 months, that's what they told me.
And I would add to that the thing.
But that doesn't mean that people are ready to go.
Yes.
Because if I say you need to show animal studies for 2 years, that means you need to meet the criteria. All that means is that nobody should be doing this
the starter gun can be fired in 18
exactly.
months.
And I think we need the education, the professional education and the culture to be highly developed to go with the guidelines, or else no one will internalize the guidelines.
So my final question, because we're running out of time, and that's one of those heinous things you can do around here, is what degree of confidence do you have that we can prevent rogue editing? Somebody with Victor's good looks and Usain Bolt's athleticism. Serious question. The presence of a rogue scientist.
I'm going to take a step back and say, why would people want to do this, right? So one is for the sake of humanity, right? So if the scientific...
Or for profit.
No, I'm going to come to that.
Okay.
All right? So if, in fact, your purpose is to do that, I believe that community peer standards is really important. These reports are going to say, we don't think that if you do it not following these guidelines, you're actually doing good for humanity. You may be doing badly. So that takes a lot away. Second would be to advance science, right? But if you don't do it in the context of what, again, these reports will say, this is what we have spoken as an international community of scientists, ethicists, etc. Third is to have fame. Well, you probably end up with infamy, right? And fourth is for profit. I would say to date, there's not a pathway to commercialization. In the United States, we don't have one. And you could argue that maybe in some countries where you can actually go all the way to IVF and then this becomes a product, I say there's not a simple, easy way, as if there are other technology that can give you commercialization easily. So I think this probably, if maybe someone's already have done this, but I kind of doubt whether new people are going to come in and try to tackle this at this point of time.
Okay,
that's
so
my opinion.
We'll end with a little quick show of hands, right? We published a global opinion poll the weekend before this meeting, a few days ago. Seems like a long time. 10,000 people around the world, and we asked the question: do you believe technology produces more good than harm in society? We were very surprised at the findings. 52% said they believed technology was responsible for more harm than good, but it was very close. It was kind of 50-50. The small minority were in favour of the positive benefits. So let's try the same theory out on this technology, on gene editing. Who believes gene editing will produce more good than harm in society? Oh, the time frame. What time frame?
I just want to say,
I'm not scientific. That's a good question.
I'm voting for somatic cell gene therapy. I'm not sure about germline.
You're not sure about germline?
But I think somatic cell gene therapy.
So should we narrow this down to germline? Yeah, like. Scientific consensus on this one? Germline therapy in the next 3 years, should we say?
3 years?
Definitely
You tell
not.
me.
No.
Too soon.
Okay. 10. Right, 10.
I don't know.
Okay, more harm than good. More harm than good in 10 years.
Well,
No,
3 people.
3 years more harm than good.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a very unscientific survey, but it gives us grounds to go away and do more research, perhaps, for next year. We hope to get you back.
Thank you.
And the questions to whom? To human beings or to nature?
Society, I'm thinking. Yeah.
Good.
Okay, all right. So it was a bad poll, but we had to end some. I meant well. It's been fascinating. I hope you don't mind we've overrun by a few minutes. It's just been so entertaining. I thought we had to. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.